Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of The Suspense is Killing Me. Today, I get to hang out with Stephen Schreffler. What's up, dude? How you doing?
I'm doing great, Lucas.
Yeah, man. We're here. We're talking about The Bleed. We have been absolutely 45 minutes of nerding out about guitar playing and recording and traveling and all the things.
hmm
So, and I see you've got a headstock behind you on
Yeah,
your
yeah.
on
This
your
is
stand,
actually the back cover of the novel.
right?
Yeah.
So is that the m- yeah, we'll talk about the inspiration for your guitar of choice on the cover. Was that your choice or
Oh yeah. I
explain?
mean, yeah. I had to go with Hetfield's guitar and
Yeah,
Gibson Explorer.
that's
It's
right.
I mean, it's not my choice. It's Barry's choice. The main character in the story. But that's definitely the kind of guitar that he would need to have.
Perfect. And we have a little bit of a Scorpions connection too. We'll talk
Yep.
about that a little bit. But all right, man. So for those that aren't aware, you have this book out, The Bleed. It's through Dark Matter Inc.
hmm
And if you guys want to check this book out or learn more about Steven, go check out darkmattermagazine.shop. And they've got a great author profile on the Dark Matter Magazine webpage for you as well. Um, Good hair shot. You got good hair in the picture, dude. Not gonna
Thank you.
lie.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. All credit to Brass Tax Barbershop.
There you go. So it says you published this in October of 2023.
Oh,
Yes,
um,
but you and I know that's not the case.
no, that was the original idea. It was a cool idea. It would have been on Halloween,
Yeah,
um, which it's funny because I actually wrote with that release date in mind.
gotcha.
And so it's actually a good time to pick it up. It's like a present tense. It's written in present tense, and you're sort of going day by day. Um, so the idea was it comes out on Halloween, and then as you're reading it, you're kind of in real time with the story. But no, it ended up coming out in July, just a couple months ago.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Well, that means everyone needs to buy the book now and then start reading it on October 31st.
yeah, it's time.
It's time. How did you, I mean, so you have a bit of a history with Dark Matter before this. You were publishing short stories with them before, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's actually so when it was Dark Matter magazine, they he was putting out these science fiction horror magazines, which are really good, really well done. He actually bought my first short story that I ever published, um, and yeah, just we gel and get each other's vibe, and so kept sticking together. And when Dark Matter Inc. fired up, he hit me up and said, "Do you want to do a novel?" It's like, yeah.
Nice. Nice. So you kind of, did you already have this whole thing plotted out before that? Or was this like, hey, let's do a book, and then you came up with the idea for the book?
Yeah, it's more of the latter. So I actually the short story that I published with them was an anthology called Human Monsters, which is a fantastic anthology, and not just because my story's in it; it's because of all the other stories. It's really good, and so they picked up my short story called Barry and Lich. It's the closer. It's the last story in the anthology, and um, it has these characters in it, and so Rob, who's the EIC over there, he reached out to me, and he really liked the story, and he was like, have you thought about novelizing it? And if you've read that short story, you could see that that puts me in a little bit of a conundrum. How do I, how do I do that? Um, and I was just honest. I was like, no, I had not thought of novelizing it, but I will think about it and how I would do that. So, um, and, kind of writing different sort of ideas and concepts, and then kind of nailed one and ended up pitching that, and he was super on board with it. So yeah, kind of building the plane as it's flying, I guess, you know?
Right. Dude, that's pretty cool, man. We've never actually talked about novelizing a short story on the show, even though I'm sure that we've like skipped across the topic before. We've never actually talked about the process of doing that.
Mhm.
And although this isn't like a writer's exclusive podcast, you know, it's also geared toward readers, just general fans of Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone who likes Stephen can listen to the show; they'll get something out of it. I do from a fellow like writer's perspective and of the interest of a reader go, man, that must be a pretty unique um, challenge when you already have something in print. And
Mhm.
to your to your hint,
Right.
there may be some obstacles with turning this into something longer. What was that experience like for you? I mean, once you got past the point of going, all right, how am I going to figure this out? Like, what was it like? Do you feel pressure, like more pressure to live up to a certain standard or ending or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, in a way, it's nice to not start from scratch. So you know, you've done some of the legwork in like a world or a setting,
Hmm,
a problem, you know, and then you have your characters which you're pretty familiar with. So there is some of that, but yeah, there are the other obstacles of like now you have something that's basically canon, you know, that you cannot deviate from without creating inconsistencies and plot holes. And but to be honest, that you know, this was actually the first novel I ever wrote.
hmm,
So you know, I don't have the experience of comparing it against that process. Um, but you know, I looked at you know what the fundamentals of what you know goes into a novel. I'd spent so much time writing short stories and um, figured I would work my way there, right, and develop a bit of a portfolio of short fiction
hmm,
to establish myself and also you know find my own voice as a writer and and suddenly I'm switching gears to writing a novel. I've got that canon that I can reference, um, but you know, having to just really go from scratch on everything else. You know, the I guess the primary challenge is like you can't, or I shouldn't say you can't. I couldn't, um, you know, think of a way to make a novel length interesting with just these two characters doing this thing that they did,
hmm.
and so who else is around them, and you know, for me, like I'm really visual. Um, like I see what's happening.
Hmm.
But you know, sometimes like I'll be walking my dog and I'll be like literally talking out loud a string of dialogue that two characters are having, and it helps me understand who they are. And
Right.
um, once I was able to sort of build, you know, it's almost like you have the short story is like the hyper focus image, and then you start to pull the camera back and see what's behind them and who's
Right.
around them. And I think as that kind of reveals itself, you know, that's how I can start sort of putting together the rest of the story.
Gotcha. And this, I mean, it has a, I mean, being a visual writer, this would be a pretty fun world to visualize because you've got a lot of like, I don't want to say it's like a hard lean retro type feel to it, but you know, you've got this 1990s kind of vibe going on, which is like you can kind of reflect back to the time period and all the cool like landscape of that time period and pull all that into your story. And it kind of makes it fun. You know, it's like, what would I have wanted my characters to talk about in 1995?
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, and there you've got plenty of things to reference
right.
there as well, you know. So
So I actually haven't published a story that's modern yet. Like,
yeah,
so I've enjoyed the process of having to revisit time periods that I lived in, but was maybe too young to really be able to remember all the specific details of.
mhm,
And also writing about time periods where I wasn't even alive yet. And so, you know, writing about 1995, obviously we're just dashing young men, but like, how, you know, like
yeah,
you do have to go back a bit and like kind of crack the web to refresh on that. Was there anything that you when you were doing that that you kind of like were like, yeah, dude, I remember that, or like that was so cool. I wish I'd experienced that.
Well, like it's funny because yeah, the short story that I originally wrote wasn't necessarily in any particular time setting. I think that there is one giveaway that I'm highly aware of um, in that short story that might date it differently. But as far as looking back at the night at like the '90s and that era, um, there's a sort of nostalgia that I think I wanted to access, and having characters that are like that age, um, but having an audience that is not that age anymore, maybe, tapping into that nostalgia feel. I think it gives you some flexibility and forgiveness,
Right.
with hitting what is already, a genre that leans on a lot of tropes.
Right. Well,
So,
and so this is I mean, I guess we should this is probably a really good point to kind of tell people about the story a little bit. But these are two high school kids in
mhm.
the 90s, and they're kind of outcasts, and they're in this small town in Michigan. And what happens, dude? Like, tell me, like, what makes these two kids in Michigan, like, what's so adventurous about this? Like, what's the big deal?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes, like you said, small town Michigan, um, mid '90s. These are high school boys, and they're in an outcast sort of social group. Metalheads, play D&D, um, and uh, basically this town that they're in called Grafting. Uh, an earthquake happens, and it's this kind of tragic event. But then shortly after that, they find themselves being blamed for a series of murders that takes place throughout the town. And being blamed for shit is something that they're very used to.
Hmm.
Um, but they end up kind of in a position where um, they have to, rather than sort of wear that kind of being blamed and being the bad kids, like wear it as a badge. Now they have to sort of, uh, you know, um, like free,
They kind of like defend themselves, right,
yeah,
against
defend
it.
themselves, absolve
Yeah.
themselves of what's going on, and almost find out in that process, like where do they draw the line? What's too far even for us?
Yeah, it's crazy, man. And their names being, is it Barry and Litch?
Which, yeah,
Right. When I first saw that, I was like, I hope I'm saying this right.
yeah,
Because,
yeah.
where did you come up with that name, man?
Yeah, Lich is I mean, it's like a D&D reference, Dungeons and
Okay.
Dragons. A Lich is a type of, you'll see it in the monster manual.
Okay.
Um, and I didn't have this backstory necessarily in the short story, I don't think. Maybe I did, but it just, kind of comes from that. And that kid ended up with that nickname based on a monster encounter that they had in one of their D&D sessions.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because normally I'm not, I always think of, I'm always worried that when I read a story that's like based on, it's like a band based or a music based or a theme based retro book, that it's going to be too cheesy.
Mhm.
That it's gonna be like, "Come on, man, are we doing this again?" Like, it's always like some crazy name, like the lead singer's name's Clash, and like the and I'm like, I don't wanna d I don't wanna do this. In fact, we were talking about LP Hernandez before,
Mhm.
and I said, "I feel so guilty as a musician and a former, like, dude who used to play music for a living for a little while. I feel guilty when I get a story that's got these music themes to it, and I'm not, for some reason it's harder to impress me or for me to enjoy it because I don't know if I'm just critical because of that experience
Mhm.
or something, but it's nice to see when written by a musician,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Uh,
Hopefully
so
there's a difference there.
yeah, I mean, so clearly it's informed, you're pulling from your experience as a teenager, musician, the whole deal. Is this YA or is this adult or is it kind of like not really easy to classify or
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't really know who makes that classification.
Mhm.
You know, like, um, would I let my middle school and high school daughters read it? Probably not the middle school one, maybe not the high school one either. Um, like, you know,
It's
that
that good?
well, it's just very violent. I'll say that much. You know, there's enough violence in it, and um, you know, I myself, I think I wrote it for more of a mature, older audience. Um, but you know, if someone's younger, they want to go read it, I'm not going to stop them.
Well, I asked that question because every time I see a retro art cover with an illustration, right, which is an illustrated cover, and high school characters, you're
Right.
automatically pushed into this world where it's like, oh, is this like Stranger Things style,
Mhm.
like audience?
Yeah.
And my 13-year-old daughter, she's just a, vacuums up the fiction.
Hmm.
And there's times when I'm like, hold on a second, like you gotta just because the cover looks like it's for
Right.
you doesn't necessarily mean it is. And I think it's an industry norm that needs to be violated a bit. I think that that they're trying to use these types of covers and storylines to appeal to certain audiences. And what it's doing is it's causing some conflict with stories that leverage the same type of art, the
Right.
same age characters. I've dealt with this a little bit with my one character, Constance, in my first book. She's barely 18. And the whole time I was writing it, it was going through editing and it was going through arc reads and all this stuff. I kept getting like, hey, is this going to be a YA read? Like right out the gate because there was an 18-year-old.
Hmm.
And I'm like, no, man. I mean, it's not written so that a YA person couldn't enjoy it,
Yeah, exactly.
but it's not written for that age group just because the character is that age, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, for sure. I think like as far as that goes, like I would say it's written for the YA in the A. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
it's you know there it's access like I talked about nostalgia earlier. It's accessing that younger part of yourself, for sure.
Mm,
But it's definitely has the lens of age on it. You're definitely
right.
looking back, and I think identifying more on that level.
Gotcha. Um, so I guess how I get one of the questions I've always wanted to ask a musician that writes a book that has this kind of flavor to it is how did you decide how much of that you wanted to build into your characters? Because I think there's a tendency to write what we know to a certain degree, but like almost all of my main characters in my series are women and obviously not a woman. So like for me, it was one of those things where I had to be careful about like it was a conscious decision to do that. If I had written male characters, I think I actually would have had a little bit of a different experience with the character development, right? However, one thing I've never done is I've never written a musician.
Mm,
Not even once, man. And I've never written a straight up writer.
yeah.
Or, I wrote one character that was I had a lot in common with in Only Darkness Remains, which is he's a prior military
Hmm.
character in like an action thriller post-apoc type. So there was a lot of like infusing my own experiences and perspectives and stuff into that character. But that genre kind of just begs for as much of it as you can give. And it's heavily embedded in the story. Where in your case, not so much. This isn't a story about a band on tour doing a thing, right? Like, so how did you decide how much of that to infuse into your characters?
Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose like the pragmatic part of me, like I mentioned before, this is my first novel, and so I wanted to almost safely access something that I knew that I knew about. Um, uh, but there's a lot of when I was that age, I was in a band. I was in a band with just me and a drummer, which is their dynamic. Um, and I know how it sort of colors your way of thinking and your approach, to everything, even at
Yeah.
that age. And um, uh, so like there's the part of it that's just being able to access a familiar territory mentally, is I really want to get in the headspace of the characters that I write so that they seem like real individuals. Um, and I can, identify very well with that. But at the same time, like, um, you know, I wouldn't say I'm a failed musician, but I'm not a professional one.
Right.
And so like I know the lengths, especially at that age, that you'll go to, thinking that like the music and the band and all that is the most important thing, and it's going to be the thing that bails you out of, the small town you live in. It's your only ticket. Um, so I wanted it to be a big part of what they do, but not necessarily, um, uh, you
Not
know,
what the story's about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Oh, that's great, man. I love that point you made about like it just colors their perspective on their risk, their
Mhm.
potential, their world, what their future looks like, because that kind of it changes the way they're going to make decisions about the things they encounter.
Right.
Um, yeah. Not to mention at that age, it's so important to you, right? Like
Mhm.
it's like your music, if you're into music at that age heavily, it's so much of who you are. And
Mhm.
there's just no separating that. So to make a character that has that in their life is a pretty substantial part of that character's um, profile.
Yeah.
Awesome, dude. So I've got to ask because you and I talked a little bit about it before we came live. Like, so you've got this music background, you're writing, obviously an artistic dude. What got you into the writing? Were you writing before you got into music, or is it like you just hand in hand? Like,
Yeah.
what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing for, like, forever. I mean, longer than I could play an instrument. So
Hmm.
I started with writing. I always loved reading, um, and just getting wrapped up in these stories as a kid. Um, and this idea that you could just sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil and just, create whatever you want and it's there. That was really exciting to me as a kid. And so it was something I always did in my free time. My parents were super supportive. Um, they would have me, read my story, that I wrote that day. It'd be like 2 paragraphs about like a T-Rex or something. But so it started with the writing for sure. And then later, I played more music and wasn't writing as much. Um, really focused on the music and trying to make that work. Um, After I grew up from that dream, revisiting the writing stuff, and had a buddy who was similar kind of background, playing music and also creative writer. So we did like we talked about how lonely writing can be, and how, something that's cool about being in a band is being able to create something together.
Mm.
Um, and so we started doing like a writer group, and just sharing our stories and feedback on that and trying to hone that. But I found that when I had, after my music playing days, shifting back into writing, there was a lot I learned about being in a band there, and creating songs, and you know the concern you have for your audience. um, it's like such a condensed, form of that artist audience interaction.
Mm.
And I found like that to be really important, and um, you know in valuing that and taking that into my writing. And so at this point, I think they both, really complement each other.
That's really cool that you pick up on that, man. I have not really ever considered that,
Yeah.
in the writing, because I like to write music. In fact, when I was every band I was in, I ended up becoming the primary riff writer, because that was kind of like my gig. And I never like I always just wrote what felt fun to me, but I could always had an ear for like what people would enjoy because like I told you before, I wrote a lot of like groove metal kind of bass stuff, and people just really enjoyed that stuff when we played it live. So I think just subconsciously I was just influenced to continue writing, like
Right.
constantly seeking that in the music that we wrote. Um, I I don't know that when I started writing fiction because I was so young that I really knew how to write for a reader. Like
Mhm.
I knew how to write a story that I wanted to tell.
Right.
But of course, when we're young, we're like pantsing and like just outright, like whatever, like
Yeah.
you said, pen and paper, just going.
Mhm.
Um, but to me, like, because you've written the short stories and now you've done the long fiction.
Mhm.
Like to me, I depend a lot on the plotting
Yeah.
in my long fiction to make sure that I'm comfortable going forward. Now I pants my butt off once I'm in the chapter, but that chapter has an intended like purpose when I start writing, or I'm hard to get started on that chapter. So to me, like to hear you say that there's so much consideration for the reader in your writing and that you have that same relationship that we kind of naturally
Mhm.
seek when you're with music, it's really good to hear you say that because that helps a lot with like the purpose of plotting.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
like
definitely.
you're building that into your story.
Yeah.
I could see where you could possibly get lost in the scene and in the writing if you were more strictly pantsing and trying to achieve that. You might lose a little bit of that. Maybe.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, that's why you're plotting, right? I mean, the book exists to be read, you know?
Right.
It doesn't exist to be written.
Right. So did you have any input on the cover? Like, was
Yeah.
this tell me about how that process worked out with you guys. Did they bring you a couple of covers to choose from? Did they ask you for your input beforehand? Like, how did this all work out?
Yeah, so, there was initial conversation, like, if I had any opinion at all, I have the option to just opt out entirely. But, I knew the kind of vibe that I was going for in writing, and the cover was coming up, before the manuscript was actually even turned in. Um, so they definitely needed my like input and feedback to help guide that. Um, and I knew like I wanted kind of that. There's a lot of love for 80s and 90s horror movies and stuff like that, and so um, wanting to kind of have a vibe that sort of speaks to that, but was really lucky to get Billy Butcher, who's a fantastic artist. I recommend everyone go look at his stuff. He does these really cool, pop culture um, blends. Um, but anyway, we told him what the novel was about, and we wanted to see if he'd be interested. He'd done some promo work for like Stranger Things and um, like The Last of Us and stuff. And we saw his famous Stranger Things season 5 art that he did, and so it was like, man, he could really nail this. Um, yeah, and just kind of described. He asked some questions about like, who are the characters, what do they look like, what are some important objects and things like that, and put together some mock-ups, and it was like, man, you nailed it. So
Nice, man. Now, did he it's spot on, like you were
yeah.
saying. Um, I thought that the cover execution on this was so good. For what you were trying to do, it's like it's perfect. And I was wondering what the story was behind that because I wasn't aware of who had done the art until now. So that's really cool.
Yeah, yeah, check out his stuff. He does some really cool art.
Yeah, and it's funny too because I think when I first read your book description, I kind of zipped right over the monster part
Mm.
for some reason, and then when I saw the cover, I was like, "Oh man, is this like a cosmic horror kind of deal? Like, what subgenre would you kind of squeeze the story into?"
I guess, sci-fi, I think it
Yeah,
fits pretty nicely into like a horror sci-fi
yeah,
vibe. You've got the shady company with technology in
Yeah.
there. So they definitely bring that to the story.
I'm writing a tech thriller next year that I've already plotted out. I've been dreaming about for a year and a half, but I can't touch it yet because I got to get these other books done before I can give myself the permission to go write in that thing. But it's a bit of a tech thriller. I mean, it's if you ask me, there's horror to it because it's terrifying to think of what happens to this this main character in this book. But I think when you start pulling science fiction and horror together, it's just so natural.
Yeah.
You know, it's like because science can be terrifying.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
I think there's a lot of horror in like blatantly sci-fi stuff. It seems like it's always just is it tilting more this way or that way, you know?
right? So did you grow up reading sci-fi, or were you more of a horror reader, or like was it like a kind of a bit of both, and you were good?
Yeah, I read straight up science fiction. That's all I did. I was always grabbing my dad's books, and he had like Michael Crichton and stuff like that. Um, so I was just binging like Michael Crichton books, um, and then also fantasy. Like I loved the Lord of the Rings, and I talked about how I played Dungeons and Dragons, so loved that element. So sci-fi and fantasy were my bag for a long time, and then my older brother, he's always it's always the older brother that has like the contraband, you know, like he was the one who had the rock music, and I could all of a sudden access that, but he was a big Stephen King fan, and um, I started reading horror through him. It's funny, the first horror book that I read was actually the Amityville Horror,
Oh God.
which is not like it's almost like a documentary,
Yeah.
you know. But I got really into being scared. I thought that was super fun. So um, when I reapproached writing after my music days, I started reading more horror, and um, I loved the closeness of it. I think we're talking about tilting sci-fi or horror. I think sci-fi tends to be, the lens is on a broad scope,
Hmm.
and almost like um, you know commenting on humanity or large groups of people, or just really, like I said, a wide scope. Whereas like horror, what I really loved about it was like that scope becomes like very individual, like and internal. It really zooms into to to what's inside. That primal id that is always running.
Wow. You know, I to me it's a funny thing because I think of horror as so emotional. Like, you have to touch people's fears in a certain way to really pull off horror. No matter what type of subgenre of horror it is. Like I write a lot of grief horror and people are like, God, like, yeah, it's the heavy stuff. And I'm like, well, it doesn't have to be all heavy all the time, but it is heavy. It's meant to be felt. But it's not like that's all that there is to a grief horror book. A real good grief horror book will have many other subgenre horror elements to it. Um, and I feel like with science fiction and fantasy, there's this automatic assumption that it's escapism,
Mhm.
right? Like you're going to go out, you're going to go do something, you're going to be somewhere else, somewhere that may not even be possible to exist. Like a fantasy land, they're thinking like creatures or places that don't exist in reality that we know of.
Yeah.
And there's like this nature of escapism that's associated with those genres. And then with horror, it's like, for some reason, there's an assumption that there's less of that,
Mhm.
and that it's like you said, it's very much an internal thing. And I feel like horror is kind of like a bridge to both. It's like if I took the escapism of fantasy and sci-fi and I integrated that real personal touch to it, you kind of get like a lot of the horror that really lands today. Um, and I love that. That's why I kind of feel like it's this universal genre that just doesn't get recognized as a universal genre as much.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a good way to frame it. It is a universal genre. In fact, I had this thought of like it's the original story is horror. You know,
Yeah.
like go back to cave paintings and like uh, warnings and messages about like what's out there, but also like I think like we have this innate gravitation towards it, whether it's explicitly genre fiction or not.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it's funny because like I had someone ask me one time, like, why, how can you read that stuff? And I said, well, it is a bit of an escape. Cause you get to read about things that you don't want anywhere near you. It's like, let me do that somewhere else. And the other part of it is like, I don't know, you're probably very familiar with Tool, the band. So they had a song Vicarious, and I just love that song. It's such an intelligent song, but it's basically about how we live vicariously through the downfall, pain, hurt, destruction, whatever of others through things, media like television and things like that. And that we're just addicted to the suffering of other people. As long as we can live vicariously through their suffering, we're safe.
Mhm.
And so give me more of that so I have less to worry about. I can
Right.
just experience that from the safety of distance or more proximity or less proximity, whatever. So when I think about horror, it's like, yeah, there is like I could drive an imaginary wedge between myself and absolutely horrific shit, and,
Right.
and experience it from a safe distance, and then I'm good, And I feel like people don't give like sci-fi that same treatment because sometimes they're not afraid of the sci-fi. They actually want to go live in it,
Right. Right.
But the bad, like the scary stuff in sci-fi, like is is aliens or alien,
Yeah.
is that horror or is that sci-fi? It's like, what is it? Well, I can tell you right now, when I saw aliens when I was growing up, that was horror to me. I was like, this is freaking terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
the only thing that made it sci-fi was that it was in outer space and there.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's really just a backdrop. It's like the the monsters of horror are they're always like an analogy, and and the character always has to face it dead on. Whereas I think with like some of these other genres, you're not necessarily doing that as much, but you know,
so did you get to choose the Misfits t-shirt or the Scorpions t-shirt?
yeah, I know. I was actually worried about that. I was like, are we gonna um, get like a copyright or something? Uh, this book is not sponsored by Scorpions or the Misfits. Uh, but yeah, I mean, band T-shirts. That was my thing. And then I was like, I always felt like I moved around a lot when I was a kid, and so I loved wearing band T-shirts because it was instantly a way to like message my people. I'm one of you. If you like this band, we can be friends now.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't,
it works.
um, but yeah, no, I definitely picked those. I guess again, it's like the characters picked them,
Right.
but yeah, yeah. If someone's wearing a Scorpions T-shirt, it says a lot about who they are. So maybe,
Maybe.
yeah.
It's funny because I've had a buddy of mine who, Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction had just come out,
Mm,
and we were pretty young. And I had a Dead Kennedy shirt because my girlfriend was a huge punk fan, and she was like, "Dude, you got to listen to Dead Kennedys." So I got into Dead Kennedys naturally, and I'm just digging this like fringe kind of feel that being a kid that was into punk in that environment, which was not popular, um, that kind of came with it, right? And people, like you said, they could identify, like they saw you
mhm,
wearing a shirt, they're like, okay, I'm making assumptions about this person based on what they're wearing. So my buddy and I get our parents to each pick up independently the CD's Appetite for Destruction from Guns N' Roses. And of course, I open up the CD case and I get out the art, the booklet. And there's this picture inside of this creature jumping over a fence or a wall. And there's this woman, and she's obviously been victimized. And I thought that was one of the most egregious looking things I'd ever seen at that age. I was like, holy shit. Like
Mm,
they put this in something that they sold to the public. It's
yeah.
like, wow. Well, my buddy shows up at school with that on a t-shirt
Oh, man.
and they make him turn his shirt inside
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, I know that treatment.
And I just remember being like, dude, you're the craziest guy I know because you actually wore that on a shirt to school. I was
Yeah.
like, what? I can't believe it's in a CD, like inside a folded thing that you can't see in public. You wore it on a shirt, dude. It's like a billboard. I'm like, wow.
Yeah. You
Made
saw
me
that when I want that on my body.
yeah, I just remember thinking like, there's no way your parents know you have that shirt and you snuck out of the house with that on and you walked up into your school with it. Like, this is totally a clout grab. Like, this is just
Mhm.
trying to set a tone. And I remember just thinking how lame I felt in my
Red Kennedy.
edgy yeah, concert tees after that. So it's a wild painting for anyone who hasn't seen it. So anyways, dude, all right. So tell me a little bit about where people are best suited to find you. Like if I wanted to
Mm.
follow your work or find out what's going on with you, like where do I go?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm most active probably on Twitter or X or whatever,
Yeah.
and Instagram. Um, I will just warn folks that like I suck with social media, so but I try to be active on there and at least you know engage with people as much as possible. So
Awesome. And do you have anything like coming up soon where you're promoting the bleed or another story? Or
oh yeah, I mean friends in Oregon can actually come meet me at the Bend Moonlight Market on Saturday. It's not the typical like bookshop setting, but I am going to be selling some books there. It's actually a cool little local event. Um, so there's that, and as far as other stuff, I've got nothing really right now that I can talk about, but aside from the bleed, but um, if you follow me on those aforementioned places, hopefully you'll be getting some cool info soon.
awesome. All right. And I'm going to completely blindside you with this question. And I usually give people a heads up, but I've failed to do that before we recorded. I'll talk a little bit so you can think if you need to, but yeah, I was just going to ask you for like any kick-ass books you've read lately that you want to recommend. Um, so I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit because I didn't give you a heads up. And I'm the guy that like, if you asked me that question, I'm a blank page, man. And I read all day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, it's funny because I want to pick. Which one do I pick?
You could pick a couple
Um,
if you want.
yeah, I mean, I picked up. I was a teenage slasher um, uh, by Stephen Graham Jones. Actually, my book and that book were published on the same day.
Nice.
I grabbed that. I'm enjoying it. I mean, anything from Stephen Graham Jones is gonna be awesome. And I'm reading that one, and then I also one some of the reviews that I've gotten on like Goodreads and stuff, where people are comparing it to other novels. I'm like, oh, I should check that out. Um, so I grabbed a book, John Dies at the End, which I had never heard of before, and I'm really liking that one too. Two different vibes, but that's what I'm reading right now. The last thing that I finished was Last Days by Brian Evenson, which I just thought that was absolutely phenomenal. Um, and it's a pretty quick read, but just absolutely brilliant. And and then last but not least, a book that I'm always going back to and think about all the time is The Fisherman by John Langan.
I've still not read that and I'm dying to get to it.
Man, I love that book, and I feel like the more time goes on, I like it even more than when I was reading it.
Hmm.
Um, it's just it really sticks with you, and yeah, I'd say those four I'll
All
throw
right.
out there. I
Y-
could say many more.
You did
Not
good, dude.
not trying to leave anyone out,
You did really good. I mean, I totally sprung that on you. I usually give people a heads up before we record. I'm like, take a minute to think because I'm going to ask. And then inevitably, I'm the guy that would always forget. So I try to give other people the heads up, but I failed to do that. So my apologies.
Oh, that's all right. It worked out.
And then my last question, which is also a blind side. It should
Perfect.
be a little easier to answer.
Bring it on.
Favorite guitar player of the 80s and
Mm.
favorite guitar player of the 90s.
All right. That is a tough one.
It's tough, dude. And it could be the same person.
Yeah, yeah. I would say 80s. Like I'm trying to pick like more 80s music.
Mm.
Because like we talked about Scorpions a lot, and maybe that's why they're on my mind. But it's more the 70s. Uh, he's wearing the Taken by Force album. So it's more of that stuff that I like there. Um, but I would say probably I might cop out and just say like a a 70s, but they were
Yeah.
still playing music in the 80s.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, Jimmy Page. It was always like my favorite. Um, even the stuff that was going on around 80s, is still good. I think their last album, Coda, was 1980, so maybe I can sneak that one in there, even though technically it's basically B-sides. But
Well, and he also did Coverdale Page. So
yeah, the most important, in his repertoire. I think Now and Zen, was that 80s or 90s?
oh, dude, that's such
Um,
a good album.
yeah, yeah. So
Uh,
I love Jimmy Page. You know, his you put on some of his solos and stuff, and you can hear like dead notes and things in his guitar playing, and I always loved that realism.
that was the cocaine, dude.
Yeah, yeah. It was the soul. Um, but yeah, in the 90s, uh, I really liked. I was really into like um, White Stripes. I told you I was a in a duo, so I liked White Stripes. I liked how Jack White, hit that blues scale, and then just with that Big Muff Pie and Digitech Whammy had a really unique sound to it. Um, yeah, and then I loved Queens of the Stone Age, so Josh Homme, in the 90s when it was
So talented.
yeah, yeah, and even with Caius, hearing his stuff there, and to this day, I love Josh Homme's guitar playing. Big inspiration.
Oh, he's fantastic. And that band is one of the single most talented rock bands on the earth right now.
Oh, I totally agree.
Hands down. I mean, their drummer is unreal.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was with Mars Volta for a while. So for people that are fans
Oh,
of
really?
Mars Volta, yeah, he was back. I'm not sure if he was in D Lost in the Crematorium or not, but the drumming on that album is just unreal.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Uh,
I had that one on repeat. Blast in the Comatorium, just always spinning. Yeah, really good.
my wife would be like, "Don't, dude." She's like, because I'm get in the car after like 2 beers. She's like driving me home, and I'm like,
Yeah,
"Hey, I got the radio, right?"
yeah. I picked up my oldest from school last week, and I had I mean, damned if I can remember the names of the songs. They're so
Yeah.
intricate and different. But I had that album on. It was track 2, which is after the intro.
Oh.
You probably know which one I'm talking about. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly. You got it. It's like I'm
yeah,
listening to the song. Uh,
yeah.
but yeah, it was way too intense for her. So, she can do like Smashing Pumpkins and stuff, though. She
Oh,
did.
okay.
So
She's a
we'll
good
put
kid.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think mine might the 80s, man. It's so hard because they were such amazing guitarists and like, as far as like technical competence, you had Eddie Van Halen just destroying everything around him. And then you had riff master James Hetfield just changing metal.
Mhm.
And then there were guitarists like Steve Vai who just moving from playing with Frank Zappa to playing with David Lee Roth to playing with White Snake. It's like
Yeah,
just phenomenal. Marty Friedman. I mean, just like the 80s is like so hard. It was like
yeah.
such a guitar era. And in the 90s, hands down, my favorite guitar player was Dimebag Darrell. So
Oh, there you go. That's
I
a
mean,
great.
just unreal talent. Although I would like to point out the genius of guitarists in the um, grunge killed killed all different types of music, according to some people. To me, they just kind of invigorated the 70s rock feel. Um, Maybe not quite as optimistically, but the brilliance of Kurt Cobain's songwriting is just unreal. But he'll never be confused as being a technical guitar player, but just as far as writing, like, who does that?
Yeah.
Nobody can do what he did, and no one has done that again.
No, yeah.
You know, which is kind of funny because, like, you take a band like Soundgarden, sounds real basic, as far as structure, and you say, all right, go learn the whole, go learn a whole Soundgarden album on guitar. It's not easy.
Yeah, let alone the vocals. I mean,
Oh my God.
yeah, Kurt was a great response to a lot of those 80s guitar players that you mentioned,
Yep.
and it was, I think, the level of permission that gave to young guitar players like me is like, I don't have to be able to shred like Steve Vai.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You've just got to like play it with heart, um
Yeah.
and you can have a crappy guitar and a crappy amp, and and
And it works.
yeah. Not
Yeah, I
that
think that's
not that his Fender Mustang was crappy. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, I dig that guitar, but
Yeah. Yeah, you don't see those around too much. I
uh,
think the guys did the Silver Sun pickups, did they play Fender Mustangs?
I don't know.
Oh, they might have actually had a
I like those offset guitars. I've got the Jazz Master myself, but
ah,
limiting it to, I think they have one pickup, right, on that Mustang.
oh my
That's pretty
God.
cool.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, my favorite all time, like, versatile guitar is still the Strat.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I've got a Strat. Everyone's gotta have a Strat.
And although I will say I was fortunate enough to play like a high-end Gibson Les Paul through a Marshall Stack Live for
Ooh,
one show, and it just does something to you because the two just go together too well.
absolutely.
But it's like wearing a piece of furniture around your neck
Yeah.
for an hour and a half.
Oh, I know. Yeah,
Yeah.
get, like, shoulder pain, you know, but those humbuckers going through a stack like that, there's nothing like it.
Yeah. So for the readers and writers that have stuck around for the guitar speak, you're welcome. And I hope that you guys will understand the connection that music has with writing. We can do the writing from the safety of our houses, and we don't have to beat each other up with furniture-sized instruments and
Right.
beer bottles being thrown at you and wondering where you were 2 days ago and not having any money still.
Yeah,
Things
yeah,
that come
absolutely.
with being a musician. All right, Stephen. Well, hey man, thanks for sticking around. Thanks for, being so diligent about communicating with me and getting on the show and everything. We've been trying to put this together for a while, and I feel like this was really cool, man, to be able to hang out with you. I hope everyone goes and checks out The Bleed, man. I mean, really cool story, awesome artwork, love the theme, love the approach, love that you put a twist on the story in a way that a lot of people right now aren't taking chances on doing. And just damn glad to have you on the show, dude.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Lucas. I really appreciate saying those nice things about the book, and glad we could finally connect here. And it was an awesome time. So appreciate the time and effort that you're putting into it as well.
Yeah, brother. Appreciate you, man. All right, guys. Well, you know the deal. Come back next time. Go check out Steven's stuff. Quit playing around. Go get a copy of The Bleed. And we'll see you guys in the next episode.